A look at three under-the-radar day two targets for the Miami Dolphins in the 2024 NFL Draft here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I am your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Today on the show, we are putting three under the radar draft targets for the Dolphins for day two of the 2024 NFL Draft under the spotlight and under the microscope. And we're looking at them as players who each one of them respectively has graded very well for me respectively as far as the things that they bring to the table and how it would fit within the confines of what the Dolphins are trying to do. So we're going to start at wide receiver with the day two wide receiver target. This is actually one of my top 5 wide receivers in the class for Miami. Pretty Ricky Pearsall. His nickname's Pretty Ricky. So I didn't just make it up. Pretty Ricky Pearsall from the University of Florida is one of the better route runners in this year's NFL Draft. And he has a very robust resume, including playing in an offense for the University of Florida that, quite frankly, left a bit to be desired. He's 6'1", 190 pounds. He ran a 4.41 40-yard dash at the NFL Combine. With a 42-inch vertical jump, a 10-foot, 9-inch standing broad jump, a 6.64 second three-cone drill, and a 4.05 second short shuttle, plus 17 reps on the bench press at 225. For perspective, he's not the biggest or the longest. From a wingspan's perspective, he's about 20th percentile. From height, he's 50th percentile. Weight, he's 22nd percentile for wide receivers coming through the NFL Combine since 2000. But his 40-yard dash at 4.41 is a 82nd percentile test. His 42-inch vertical jump is 97th percentile test. His standing broad jump is 88th percentile. His three-cone drill is 93rd percentile. And no wide receivers run the three-cone anymore. So he ran it for a reason. It's because he's got big-time agility. 89th percentile short shuttle, 71st percentile bench press. So very impressive testing numbers across the board. And then you cross-reference that with almost 1,000 yards for the University of Florida this past year, and a very well-rounded skill set. It's one of the best set of hands of wide receivers that I've seen in this year's class. He made one really incredible catch against University of Charlotte, and it's University of Charlotte, and I understand that, but a Odell Beckham-esque catch working up the seam on a ball that was high. That was a one-handed catch in traffic. He sports a 50% contested catch rate with a 3% drop rate. He wins vertically. His 11 deep catches down the field were tied for 34th amongst college football wide receivers this year. He forced 9 missed tackles. He wins from the slot. He has about a 50-50 slot to perimeter snap usage this past season. He was targeted 87 times for 65 receptions, 963 yards, plus some scheme touches like on end arounds and getting the ball in his hands in space, utilizing his athleticism throughout the course of the entire season. Ricky Pearsall, to me, the route running with the hands, with the ability to work the middle of the field, with some schemed targets, with a little bit of added size and length, and the explosiveness profile that he has, really feels like he could be the blend of a lot of the different kinds of wide receivers that Miami has. Now, he's not going to be a physically imposing 225, 230-pound wide receiver on the perimeter, but he can win on the perimeter. Now, this was not the first season that he took meaningful snaps outside. He took meaningful snaps outside in 2021, which he took about 60% of his offensive snaps on the perimeter. It was much closer to a 50-50 split this past season. But the fact that you have the success in the middle of the field, the fact that you have success forcing missed tackles with the ball in your hands, the fact that you have contested catch ability and reliable hands, all of that adds up to me to be an attractive blend of traits that I kind of put him in the same stratosphere of Ladd McConkey, but I think that Ricky wins a little bit more all around, as whereas Ladd, I think when you watch him on film, guys who can be physical and crowd him give him a little bit more of a challenging time, where I think Ricky Pearsall can and is a little bit more physical throughout the entirety of the route right now. So that's a player, Ricky Pearsall, who you don't really hear the buzz in the first round. You're really going to be fascinated to see after the big three when the second run on wide receiver starts. Is it in the late teens? Is it in the early 20s? Is it in the late 20s? If it's in the late 20s and you got guys like Leggett and Mitchell and Worthy and McConkey and Thomas and Coleman, and that block kind of hits their run, you could still see a guy like Ricky Pearsall, in spite of this very robust and dynamic athletic skill set, while being one of the best route runners in the class and having really good hands. He just doesn't necessarily have the elite vertical speed or the elite physicality that some of these other guys maybe have a more dominant trait that they can hang their hat on. Ricky is a little bit more of a well-rounded player, but this is a dude I'd love to see in Miami, Ricky Pearsall. And I know, University of Florida, not a lot of love lost there, and I get that for South Florida. But at the same time, he's a transfer from Arizona State, so maybe that gets him a little extra leeway. Who knows? We're going to shift gears to the defensive line. I got an interior player, or a hybrid player, really, and then an edge rusher, and that's up next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Under the radar day, 2 targets for the Dolphins. Stick with us. It is officially playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Major League Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. It's $150 win or lose bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Let's talk Brandon Dorlus from the University of Oregon, who is a player who's kind of been on my radar for a while, just because he pops every time I watch the University of Oregon. He's an interesting player because of the versatility that he brings to the table. He's been a consistent starter. He's played at least 600 snaps in 3 consecutive seasons for the University of Oregon. And depending on the year, he's taken snaps in different places. Back in 2021, about 50% of his snaps came in the B gap as an interior defender. Then you go to 2022, and he took 400 snaps out of 651 outside the tackle as a defensive end. And this past year, in 2023, pretty evenly spread across a 4, a 6/7, an outside player, and then a 3 technique or a 2. Not a lot of reps in the A gap at 280 pounds, but A gap, B gap, C gap, all the way in and out the offense or the line of scrimmage. He is charged with playing all of those spots and at least 40 pressures in 3 consecutive seasons as well. So this is a volume taker who gets consistent push and rush against the quarterback. It's a nice blend. At 6'3", 285 pounds. He has a 81-inch wingspan, which is 70th percentile for defensive tackles to come through the NFL Combine since the year 2000. He ran a 4.85 with a 1.68 10-yard split. That's 93rd and 83rd percentile, respectively. Vertical jumps, or his jumps, his explosive jumps, vertical of 30.5 inches for defensive tackles is 65th percentile, and his standing broad jump of 9 feet 3 inches is 82nd percentile. So some really impressive explosiveness, long speed, but then also short area explosiveness And then a 3-cone drill that was 75th percentile, 7.43 seconds amongst defensive tackles. When you cross-reference his athletic profile, it's a unique build to project because at 285, 283 pounds, he's not really meeting your stereotype for an interior defensive player. More of these guys are closer to 300 pounds, right? But this is a guy who back in 2022 was playing stand-up edge rusher off the edge. And when you contrast his 10-yard split, which is your ability to get off the ball and your line is get off the line of scrimmage in your pass rushes amongst all defensive linemen. So you include defensive ends in this conversation. It's still a 60th percentile test. So we've got some length. We've got some first step explosiveness. We got some lower body power. And you got some positional versatility that I think Anthony Weaver's defense would absolutely have a blast with. He's not necessarily a dominant run defender. I think one of the things that stood out to me for Brandon Dorlus and one of the reasons why he may originally struggle being a highly effective 3-down player from the jump is not only is a little bit lighter in the trunk as far as just the mass that he carries versus your average interior defensive player. He also plays with high pads at times, which then sacrifices his ability to leverage and anchor and control a blocker. He's a little bit more of a penetration style player as compared to somebody who is going to consistently get hands on, read the block, feel the block, and discard. You see the flashes of it. And he played big in some big games. I thought the Oregon State game, which is a big rivalry this past season, he played well. I thought he played well against Washington as well. The second time in the Pac-12 championship game, I thought it was his better performance of the 2 games against Washington. So this is a player who, from Miami's perspective, if they're looking for, well, we want some contributions on the edge, we want somebody who can reduce inside when we're going to have Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb out on the field, kind of Darius Robinson's the first name that comes to mind, but Brandon Dorlus is a contingency player who kind of meets some of the same benchmarks. You know, Robinson's 6'5", 285 with an 84-inch wingspan and has a slower 10-yard split than Brandon Dorlus does. So Dorlus is the same size, about the same length. Robinson's got him in pure arm length, but the wingspan, it's 84 versus 81. It's a big difference, but it's still like a plus test for Dorlus. And then Dorlus is better 40 speed. He's got the same broad jump. He's probably got better agilities. I don't think Robinson ran the agilities. The difference is Darius Robinson has played at 265 and played on the edge, but has also historically at Missouri played at 290 and played kind of the same hybrid role. So if they have eyes for that kind of player that you can maybe double dip on a little bit, you can get a guy who can help your defensive interior, but a guy who can also bridge for you until you get Phillips and Chubb back at 100%. I don't think this is a bad backup plan to Darius Robinson, who's projected to go earlier in the draft. And there's some ways in which Dorlus is a better tester. I think Robinson's a better run defender. I think Robinson's better on the edge than Dorlus is. Dorlus is better inside. But with the pad level stuff for Dorlus, I do think he's a rotational guy who maybe could benefit from being on the edge and being a heavier-handed guy on the edge early in his career until he's more consistent with the pad level. So it's a very interesting kind of foil of your typical, well, we want a nose tackle or we want one of these pass rush guys like Johnny Newton or Byron Murphy at around 300 pounds. You go a little bit lighter, you can have some mobility to move a guy up and down the line of scrimmage. And nobody in this class has a resume that shows that better than Brandon Dorlus, who's a day 2 target for somebody in the 2024 NFL draft. Now we're going to talk about a guy who I just recently watched, and he blew me away. I'm a huge fan of this player. I think his profile probably projects in a range where Miami doesn't have picks right now, kind of that dead area, end of day 2, beginning of day 3. But Mohamed Kamara from Colorado State is a player who, if they just want a pass rusher and to be a designated pass rusher and come in and win off the edge with some speed and explosiveness, it's a name we got to talk about. And that's going to come up next here on this episode of Locked on Dolphins. So stick with us. Mohamed Kamara, Colorado State, is not going to win any first off the bus pageants as it pertains to being a football player. 6'1", 248 pounds, 32 3/8-inch arms, and a 78.5-inch wingspan. Amongst edge rushers since 2000 at the NFL Combine, that is 3rd percentile height, 11th percentile weight, 10th percentile arm length, and 22nd percentile wingspan. It's not great, but you have 4.57 40-yard dash with a 1.58 10-yard split. That is 93rd and 91st percentile. Explosive, 250 pounds with a very low to the ground center of gravity thanks to his build and his frame. And he will just take you for a walk. He has been a productive pass rusher in each of the last 3 seasons, 9, 6, and 14 sacks across the last 3 seasons. And this past season, he had 65 total pressures, or 64 total pressures on quarterbacks. The year before that, I'm going to do the math live, 45, 47, over 50. So there is some dominant looks at just walking back offensive tackles on his tape. Now, he played at Colorado State, so the level of competition is something that you do acknowledge. But as a designated pass rusher, if you're going to come in and play 15 snaps and you're going to be super fresh, it's kind of like the Bryce Huff thing with the Jets. And obviously, Huff signed a big deal with the Jets this past, or with the Eagles in free agency this past cycle. But he was kind of a stone cold killer for the Jets off the edge as a rotational pass rush guy. I think Mohamed Kamara has a little bit, more than a little bit, really, of Yannick Ngakoue to his game. And Yannick Ngakoue profiles very similarly when you look at Mock Draftable and you look at the comparables with the athletic profiles. Ngakoue is in the top 5 matches for Mohamed Kamara's athletic profile. Because he was 6'2" versus 6'1.5", 252 pounds versus 248, 32.5-inch arms versus 32.5-inch arms. Kamara's actually got a better 10-yard split and a better 40 than Ngakoue does too. But because they're both built so low to the ground, they have this slipperiness about them, but they also have the ability to convert speed to power and walk you back because they're naturally just under your pads. And you see that with Mohamed Kamara, whether it's Washington State or Colorado or Utah State or Nevada. I mean, there are some dominant reps. He had almost a 20% pass rush win rate this past season. Mohamed Kamara did. And he's an exclusive outside guy. Another guy who I think there's some parallels to, ironically enough, is Shaq Barrett, who, ironically enough, also came from Colorado State as an undersized pass rusher. But again, Kamara, the explosiveness, it's more prevalent in his game. And because of the size and because of the lack of length and because of maybe some of the concerns about him being an early down player, this is a player who might end up lingering into the end of day 2, beginning of day 3. But if Miami's committed to, well, we want some cheap pass rush, we want to make sure we have enough competition in this room, we have enough youth and explosiveness in this room, we have guys that know how to rush the passer, and can compress and collapse the pocket. This is a guy who's 1,000,000% on my radar. I would love for them to add him to the mix. The question is, of course, the value versus the, are you going to hope he gets to 158? Are you going to reach on him at 55? I wouldn't reach on him at 55, but I don't think he'll be there at 158 just because the pass rush resume is too good. It's impressive. So this is one of those players for Miami that, if you can come upon an extra draft pick kind of in that stratosphere of end of day 2, if you trade down, hypothetically, we did this show. You trade down a few spots, you could theoretically pick up a 4, an early 4. Could he be there for that? If you trade down a ton, you could maybe get a late 3. The board's got to be right for that early, but this is a guy who I think could be a really, really good asset. And learning from Shaq Barrett, I think, would only make him a more exciting ad for the Dolphins. So those are a couple of under-the-radar fits for Miami that I really, really like. In summary, Ricky Pearsall, I think, is an outstanding option at 55 if they go with the trenches early in the draft with that first-round pick. As far as Brandon Dorlus, maybe a candidate for 55. I think in a perfect vacuum, I'd ideally like that if you trade down from 55 and pick up some extra draft capital that way and slide down the board a little bit. That might be a player that makes some sense. But then Mohamed Kamara is probably, from a value perspective, somebody that you would need to use the extra draft picks you picked up from whatever moves that you make, whether you go up or down, to add him to your ranks. That's going to do it for this second episode of Locked On Dolphins here today on Wednesday, April 10th, 2024. Unlike a little doubleheader, we got one in today. Hope you guys enjoyed this spotlight on a couple of day 2 NFL draft prospects. I'm Kyle Krabs. You could keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Make it a good one. We're out of here. Fins up.